So our agenda for today is I'm going to give a brief overview of the user documentation subteam for UAC and what our activities have been this year and some of the things that we're working on. Christine's going to follow up with a little overview of our counterparts over on the Technical Advisory Council side and what their activities are. And then we're going to open up the floor and we have some discussion questions prepared. But if there's anything you would all like to talk about or ask about related to the user manual or the technical documentation for ArchivesSpace, this is going to be your forum to ask some questions for us. So I'll start. So on the User Advisory Council Documentation Subteam side, is there anyone on the subteam who's here today besides me? Not to put anyone on the spot, but it doesn't look like it. So our responsibilities are to assist in the maintenance of the ArchivesSpace user manual, which some of you may know it's at docs.archivespace.org. It is the manual for how all of the different modules in ArchivesSpace work. It is provided as a benefit of membership in the ArchivesSpace community. We work with Jessica, the community engagement coordinator, to channel updates for each new release into the user manual so that that gets updated on the same schedule as the releases. We're beginning to work more with the documentation subteam on the Technical Advisory Council side on areas of concern to both of us in terms of documenting different features and different modules and things. And looking for ways to improve the user manual and the associated documentation that comes with the user manual on behalf of the ArchivesSpace community as we receive feedback from the community, from folks at our institutions who also benefit from that membership. So that's kind of a broad overview of what the documentation subteam for UAC does. We had a couple main projects for this year. The first one was to work on auditing the existing user manual to determine where it needed to be updated, areas where it had gotten kind of out of sync with the release schedule, and whether there were features that existed in 2.6 that hadn't yet been documented in the user manual, looking for things like broken screenshots, out-of-date language, stuff like that. Reviewing that documentation for each of the different modules and sending those updates to Jessica to get included in the user documentation. And the second activity that we did this year was a brief survey of the ArchivesSpace community members who are maintaining their own documentation for ArchivesSpace, either instead of or in addition to the user manual, to find areas where some of that custom documentation that members are writing is in alignment with or complements the user manual, to try and find ways in which we as the documentation subteam can kind of integrate some of that local documentation with the user manual in places where that makes sense and work on some of those integrations. Kind of alongside that, I'm going to be very vague about this part, but there's a new documentation platform on the way, replacing the system that exists right now. Right now, the application that Lyrasis uses for documentation makes it so that only one person can update the documentation. So our current maintenance workflow is to come up with these changes and then send them to Jessica so that she can make the changes on our behalf. The system that we will be moving the user manual to will allow for multiple users, so that we'll still be coordinating with the community engagement coordinator, with Jessica, on those changes, but it'll be possible for the members of the docs subteam to actually make changes themselves once they get approved. So that'll make our lives a lot easier. I can't yet say what the new application will be, but I can say that it's on the way soon. I'm just going to real briefly go through just a review of some of the survey results that we got when we put out the documentation writer survey on the user group forum earlier this year. We received 31 responses to the survey. Everyone is aware of the user manual, so that's good. 100% of respondents. About 77, a little over 3/4 of the people who replied to the survey indicating that they wrote their own documentation did consult the user manual when they were writing their own documentation. A lot of the people who did indicated that they were hoping with their local documentation not to replicate what had already been written in the user manual, so that kind of confirmed a lot of what we had suspected, that people's local docs are all about their local practices, the ways in which they're using particular properties and data fields in the database for their own instances and implementations of the application. There, 81, a little more than two-thirds, a little over 80% of the people who replied, sorry, I'm pulling out my notes, 80% of the people who have their own local documentation are using the user manual, not necessarily consulting it, but using it in addition to their local documentation. Most of that 19% who don't, either people weren't aware of the documentation, or they personally didn't have access to the documentation because it's sort of channeled through someone not them has access to the account that accesses their documentation. So it was access issues were the main reason that was cited for people not using it. Slightly fewer people were willing to share their documentation with others. It was kind of a 2-to-1 split between people who would share their stuff and people who wouldn't. Reasons why included just a general commitment to sharing what they've learned with others in the community, because they learned from others in the community when they were implementing ArchivesSpace. There was a little bit of people were willing to share, but what they were more hopeful for were easier ways or an easier pipeline for community members to make suggestions for improvement as far as what was in the user manual and how it could be more useful for them. And a lot of the responses we got to the survey were those sorts of suggestions, which was really helpful. So I think that once we have sort of a more open platform in place for updating documentation, we can kind of commit to some of those changes. Reasons why people would be unwilling to share were mostly that their documentation was too local and it wouldn't necessarily apply if it was shared more broadly with other institutions. But they would be willing to share, maybe not necessarily like openly on the web, but if somebody asked, they would definitely give their user manuals to people. That's all of my prepared remarks for UAC. I'm going to turn it over to Christine now.
So I'm here representing the technical documentation subteam of the Technical Advisory Council, but there are very dedicated people that are on that subteam. Alicia Dedelich of Yale is the leader for that subteam, and then there are members like Dallas Pillen. And is anyone else from that subteam here? I don't think so. But so they do great work. So I'm just representing that, not representing work that I do myself. So the technical documentation, sort of what we define as technical documentation for the application, is documentation that provides instructions for deploying ArchivesSpace from a technical standpoint. So that's things like installing ArchivesSpace, configuring it, updating it when versions change, and otherwise maintaining the application itself. It also encompasses some information for accessing ArchivesSpace via the API or doing development work related to the application, like building plugins. Most of the technical documentation is in written form, on the web written form, but there are also, I should say, videos on YouTube that supplement or illustrate some of the technical concepts. The technical documentation is publicly available. A membership is not required to access the technical documentation. And the reason that distinction exists is because the idea is that to get ArchivesSpace up and running, you do need to know how to install it, say, or how to configure it. But that the user documentation is more like value added. There's different ways, and that's illustrated by people writing their own documentation. There's different ways that people could actually use the application, and different ways they actually work through the different modules. But so the program and community maintained user manual is considered value added. The technical documentation subteam, very similarly to what Kevin described for the user documentation subteam, they maintain and facilitate contributions to the technical documentation itself. They also identify gaps and conduct surveys of the community to identify additional technical documentation needs. They work closely with Lainey on this, at Lainey as the sort of technical experts of the ArchivesSpace team. Some of the recent projects that they've worked on, The ArchivesSpace technical documentation used to be embedded in the code of the application, so it was even harder to sort of pick out and update and things like that. So the technical documentation subteam worked on pulling that out, putting it into its own GitHub repository, and making it kind of maintainable, separate from the code itself. They do, when people submit improvements directly for the documentation, they're the ones who kind of review those and approve those to go into the documentation. And one of the things that they're really interested in doing and have kind of gotten started doing is building a list of people in the community that are interested in contributing to the documentation. And they're also interested in building up that community to get more people interested in contributing to the documentation. Here are some links. All of these presentations are going to be posted on the wiki, so there's no expectation that you would take these links down now, but these are links for some of the things that we mean by the technical documentation. There's a sort of a searchable version of it, in addition to the GitHub repository where it actually lives and people can put suggestions in there for improvements. There's a separate area for the API documentation. There are some developer screencasts that kind of explain the technical architecture of ArchivesSpace, how it's put together, how to kind of, why certain decisions were made about what it is, as well as how to implement it from a developer perspective. Hudson Malonglo, the original developers for ArchivesSpace, did those back at the beginning. Many people have found them helpful. And then we do also have other screencasts that we maintain on the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel. They include things like rebuilding an index, and we actually have a whole list of additional screencasts for system administrators that we're looking for people to record, in addition to working with some of our colleagues at Lyrasis to do that. So hopefully that will be built out further soon. Okay, so Kevin and I came up with a number of different questions that we wanted to ask people here, as well as, just whatever questions you have or whatever thoughts you have about documentation. We're very interested in getting a discussion going. But maybe we could start out with the most basic of questions. Kevin presented the results of the survey that they did, so maybe we have a good sense of the first one. But maybe from raising your hand, how many people in this room have used the user documentation for ArchivesSpace? So pretty much everybody, right? Except for Jessica. Jessica didn't raise her hand. She'll need to see that. So conversely, how many people have used the technical documentation for ArchivesSpace? Far fewer, far fewer. And that's kind of what we would expect, I would say, at an event like this. But part of the reason that the technical documentation subteam is interested in growing that community. Do you know where to look or where to point your system administrator or developer when you have a question about how to do something in ArchivesSpace? Where would you look if you had to do that? Do you know where to look? Or do you feel like, I don't know where to go?
I know where to go for the API, and it's bookmarked on my bookmark bar, literally right there. But I wouldn't know where to point you for plugin instructions.
For plugin information.
I would start with Google search and I would look through everything, but I don't have that off the top of my head. I can't picture the web page.
Yeah. Are there other kinds of questions that you feel like you'd like to answer? Anne-Marie.
Well, actually, Valerie just made me think of it. Web customizations. So I knew that there was one on Confluence that Yale had put out about the new PUI. And then I didn't even know there was this other one until Valerie sent it to me, which was in a different place with the things that could be changed. And I think there's something like on GitHub too, but nothing in the user docs about it.
And I don't even know where I got that link from.
Yeah.
But then I bookmarked, so I don't even know how I came across that. The one that.
So things like how to change certain things in the PUI specifically?
Yeah, like whatever could be changed.
Actually, I'd say definitely highlight the PUI because I'm sure that's what people ask the most about, but customizations in the configs in general.
In the configuration file.
Yeah. Which config does what, and are there any ramifications to changing things? Where are those in the source code?
Yeah. Other things on the user side or the technical side, of course, that you're looking to do, and right now it's hard to figure out how to do. Yeah.
And actually it was from you. One of our customers was asking about a report. They wanted to change the way agents were listed in it. And I know it can be modified, but I still haven't figured it out. I looked at I can't remember if it was a YAML file for it or a style sheet. I can't remember, but I haven't figured it out and I haven't found docs.
So changing what the query is that the report is based on?
And I looked through those queries as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
they wanted to publish all agents, including staff.
Yeah. So people, and that might be common for people on the user side or the technical side, you want to do a report that isn't exactly what's in the application, and you'd like to know how to make those changes. And Dallas, today you talked about a few custom reports that you've done.
Yeah.
Did you look at documentation for that, or did you come up with that yourself?
Reports I looked at another plugin, maybe that Hudson Milano would put together with some custom reports for somebody else. Because that one, it was a little bit different than modifying like the style sheet for the application. So I think I had to look at it in an existing example of a custom report that had been made and just sort of reverse engineered it and figured out how to do my own.
I think that's what we did when we did our custom reports at Denver. It was like someone else wrote one, and I learned how to do it from that.
Yeah.
Probably the same one you did. Or maybe I learned it from yours, because you, yeah.
One thing from yours.
Yeah.
A good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
A question that came up earlier the morning session was about the user assessment in terms of reference analytics.
Yeah.
And how we're going to track like who's clicking on what folder or box to kind of see like ready and research usage collections. I don't know if that's even there yet or that's in the
So on the public side or the
public side.
public side, more kind of analytics of who's looking at what for
Yeah,
there.
like how much time they're spending
Yeah.
on.
That kind of work can be done with Google Analytics.
Okay.
Yeah, we're trying to implement that.
You're trying, yeah, that was the other question, like, does Google, how far down does Google go into AS? And
So I understand it, is that it can go down to that archival object level, and it can also let you know when actions are taken. For instance, they click on a request button or a help button, so that you'll be able to see where they're taking.
and that's, sorry, where do you figure out how to put the Google?
So this, I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask.
Okay.
Technical, but we've done Google Analytics training, and I know that in order to get those action items into Google Analytics, there's specific code that I will be working with our IT department to make those to make sure that it's recorded.
But it sounds like it could be useful documentation of how to set up Google Analytics with ArchivesSpace. I mean, some things are just, this is how Google Analytics works. Probably doesn't make sense for us to write that documentation. But when it's to make it specific to ArchivesSpace and the limitations or the good things, that seems like it would be useful documentation, it sounds like.
I think we have a plugin. We did a plugin that does that, so I could probably write that documentation.
There you go,
Yeah.
you can write it.
I didn't expect to come away from this with action items, but all right. I brought that
Good thing.
brought that upon myself.
Yeah,
I'm looking through the user documentation right now, and I think that what I'm about to say is valid. A heading on how to set the record templates. So it is not intuitive that you have to browse accessions and then set the accession template. And
for default
for
default
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 values.
value, yeah.
So, and that might be in there, but it's probably buried under accessions or under resources. So as its own heading, setting default values. And there
So-
might only be 2 action items under there, but it would take it away from being so varied.
So kind of some of those, because I think it is there,
Yeah.
but yeah, the way it's sort of structured is things are sort of deep within
Yeah.
each record type.
And sometimes by record type makes perfect sense, but
Yeah.
when you expand like something like resources or accessions or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it may be, and this is specifically on the user documentation,
Yeah.
but it may be that in moving to a new platform, maybe some reorganization would be helpful.
And that was one of the things we talked about when we were evaluating possibilities is as we migrate, like the way it's set up now might not make sense when we move to the new things, so we'll probably.
And does your new thing have a potential link of like, can you improve this page? Like if you've ever used like this documentation, they have that on like every single. You don't have to answer.
No, I was going to say, does it to Jessica?
We'll see.
Yeah, okay.
Rephrase it.
And that wish list there.
Yeah, that way it sends you an email with like the exact record that the person's talking about.
Yeah, and I think now I'm going to get, I don't remember if I talked about that in this context or if it was like a work thing, but I think we talked about that as a way to encourage contributions. Because
Right now, if I saw a typo here, I probably would email you, but somebody might not know to do that.
Yeah.
So we have a multi-repository situation in a single instance, and there really isn't documentation about sort of managing different parts. If you're trying, when I'm in my repository, I see an agent record, and I think it's not attached to anything, but it could be attached to something in another repository, but I can still delete it. And so just something that you should know about
Yes.
when you have a multi-repository, these are the impacts of doing action.
So it's like sort of a higher level, like multi-repository best practices
Yeah.
or things to pay attention
Yeah.
to when you're in a
Control
multi, yeah,
similar sort of, you can't see everybody else's stuff.
yeah.
That's a great suggestion. I tried deleting a location record for like a month before I realized that somebody else had linked to it in another repository.
They didn't like that. Other things that you wish you knew how to do, you wish there was something, well, there's plenty you might wish you would wanted to do, but something that in theory could be documentation that you could go to that you wish you knew how to do. Yeah.
I regret saying this because some screencasts send some really basic API requests, how to authenticate. Like no further than that, just like start with like authentication in your first get.
Yeah.
And like don't bother going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, definitely like the API documentation right now is really just like a series of endpoints, right? And it's not very how-to.
You have to know what you're looking at.
Exactly, you have to know. Now something like that, so right now the API documentation is in with the technical documentation. And we definitely, like as Kevin was saying, there's a lot more ways that the two groups could work together, and there's definitely like gray area where stuff that is on one side would be helpful to the other side. Is the API something that more and more people from a user perspective, they would like to see that in the user manual? Yeah.
I think that would be helpful. Like, I'm not our sysadmin or other visual issues like librarian takes care of the back end and would take care of any API requests we have. And I went to the ArchivesSpace training last year and realized that a lot of things that I had been doing manually and which I could have done in bulk could have been done in bulk. I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
So even something as simple as in the user documentation, if you wanted to do this thing a whole lot,
Yeah.
then you should talk to your sysadmin about working with the API.
Yeah. Even just a basic definition for somebody who's browsing it and who's never even heard the term before, it could be a little disclaimer. And then a further link to the technical documentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even remember. The user manual might not even have anything about the API.
It definitely doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I shouldn't say definitely because I don't have it open in front of me.
I haven't
but-
read all
I did
10,000
yeah.
pages.
And it's not in the glossary either, so even just a glossary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly, like, none of this is like wanting to like take stuff that's freely available on the web and move them behind a paywall. That's not what we're talking about here, but it's more like how the user manual can be more helpful And yeah, cross-referencing and things that are geared to the different audiences and the way that they approach the application, for sure.
How about an FAQ? Do you guys get the same questions over and over?
We have FAQ on the website, but it's more, it's not so much how to do things in the application. Or it's not at all how to do things in the application. It's about things like membership and what is open source software and things like that. So FAQs about how to do things in the application, you think? I mean, obviously it would be very helpful to crowdsource a list of what those things would be, you know? Yeah.
Is there any, besides the listserv, is there anywhere where people can like report a list of errors, import errors, I should say, as we do migrating into AS, like just the way we can say, I got this error, and this is error, and this is how I fixed it, or I still have a problem. Is there a missing where that can be put out?
No, there definitely isn't like a central knowledge base of what errors mean and how people fixed them. But yeah, I could definitely see how that would be useful. Anything else? Yeah.
Going back to that report I was talking about,
Yeah.
and I know that the source code is available, but I'm not a developer, so I don't really know what I'm looking at when I look at that.
Yeah.
I wish there was like a map that showed the tables and the fields in the tables and their connection to like the relationships between, you know, this unique identifier with that unique identifier.
Yeah. We do have, the report subteam worked on a data dictionary that has some of that, but is not like, well, and part of this is because of how ArchivesSpace is built, is it's hard to get a nice, neat table because it's like crazy number of tables. But yeah, I can definitely see how that would be helpful. A lot of this definitely falls into the next question, but we can continue along those lines of what do you think could be better about the documentation? Are there other things that we haven't already said?
Every time I try to look for a crosswalk, like to EAD or to Mark, I get pointed back to the same page from like 2015.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to have an updated version of those. Maybe even have it automated, because we have some customizations in our setup. It would be really nice if we could just pull down what exactly our crosswalk was, rather than having to reverse engineer it, which is what we often do.
So from I definitely get the part about updating the crosswalks that haven't been updated for a long time.
So
But part of the custom.
Yeah, so we have certain fields going into certain mark fields in particular. And so that's extra code that we have.
Yeah.
If there were a way to essentially pull out
from the code.
from the code, exactly from the code, not having to like manually go in and say, oh, this is going into the 544 sub D. Just have a way to pull that out so that we knew this particular piece of resource was going into this mark subfield.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there is. I know that Laura and Lainey have definitely pulled things for me to create maps that are more up to date than some of the maps on the website. So it might be possible. And is that it? Do you have that in a plugin, or you have that in just post-processing, or how does that work?
We have a couple of different places, but we definitely have code that's, we're hosted in Lyrasis, and so we have custom code. I don't know exactly where it lives in the code, but we ask that like a local identifier goes into an 001 field, for example. And so they did that on their end.
Yeah. Anything else that people can think of now that could be better about the documentation? Okay. So Kevin gave some stats on what people said in the survey, but do you keep your own local documentation? And if you do, how does that differ from the centrally maintained documentation?
Well, we've developed our own user manual and changed the definitions of some of the fields and things, so it's geared to our practices. And when we set up the appraisal project a couple of years ago, we had to create a separate repository for those because some of the definitions differed than what they would for a regular finding.
For when you're using it for the
Yeah,
other
so,
thing.
you know, so we've kind of detailed all of that, you know, different manuals for accessioning, appraisal, resources, and I'm working on assessments, so.
What do you do, what is that documentation in? Do you have, is it on the web? Is it a Word file? What kind of, what did you use to create that?
It's a Word file.
Word file.
Yeah. I think we've loaded some of it up,
Yeah.
but I can check and see if it's all this intent. But it's specific to our practices.
Yeah.
So.
Do other people have a local user manual that they created? Yeah.
So Yale has a training manual that's just a Google Doc that is open to suggestions from viewers. So we use that as also a way to have a kind of open discussion over like if some sort of description or instruction needs to be more fleshed out or isn't working or needs an addition, people add to it. So.
Yeah.
And that's managed by our the committee that manages our ArchivesSpace instance, which is shared across all repositories.
Now, would you all, like, given that you have like a pretty extensive, and you too, Laura, do you go to the ArchivesSpace user documentation at all at this point, or is it pretty much like you stick to your local documentation?
No, we're still trying to figure out how to get the Excel plugin to work.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we go and look for things like that. I'm going to be looking at it more for the assessments to see if there's, you know, more than what I'm seeing that I can start using when I start this in September.
Yeah.
So yes, we do. We have someone in our IT department that can spend a little bit of time on ArchivesSpace. And so we, you know, he kind of goes through and keeps up with some of the technical data, but Becky and myself look more for, you know, how to change templates and things like that. So
it sounds like it's still useful to you.
well, it still is useful to us because we haven't started importing and exporting resources yet. Trying to cut down, and we've got some scripts written on ways, you know, for some of the before edit and after edits.
Yeah.
Still looking for a way to where you could just export the EAD file directly into our online finding aid repository, but I understand that it still has to, it doesn't come out pure EAD and other people still have to.
Yeah,
go
you
through
usually have to do
oxygen
some
for
processing
lots
on
of
the
things.
yeah.
So I keep looking for that fits.
I think there's not magic documentation out there for that.
We've kind of moved ours away from, it used to like almost duplicate the user manual, but
Really?
at some point a switch flipped and our students who came in to work for us stopped saying they read documentation and they started saying we watch YouTube videos. And so at that point it was like, well, let me introduce you to the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel where all of the videos are.
Oh,
and
so they actually watch the videos on their YouTube
every day.
channel.
They love it. They love it. We're probably most
They
of your
love it. Oh, that's good.
we're probably most of your, well, I shouldn't, yeah. We're a lot of your hits, for sure.
That's good.
So yeah, we've kind of it's, for us now, it's a data dictionary and it's a mirror of our plugin documentation because they're not going to go to GitHub. They're going to check the wiki. So that's what ours looks like now, or is starting to look like now.
I did stop using it after a while. Like I oriented myself. I personally wrote the whole darn best practices for my students. And then because of that really intensive experience, I didn't need to refer back to it. But because you prompted me today, I started looking back through it, and I realized that it's been like vastly improved since the last time I looked at it. It's fantastic. So I don't know if you do this, but if there's new information for an upcoming release, and you obviously have to write a new section, do you mention in the release notes or in the announcement that, oh, and remember to check out the fact that we have included like 10 new pages for this new functionality in the user documentation? Because I wouldn't have thought to go back.
I think
an
it's
example of
pretty
that is,
rare that we put
configurable
that.
URLs. I went to that session and I didn't realize, oh, that's in the docs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think part of why we ended up in effect rewriting the user manual is the last time I looked at it a lot was for like version 0.8 point something, and I just tell people look at that now, and same thing, people look at it because we forgot our password for a while too. So yeah, some things happen, but yeah, no, it's great. People use it a lot. I forgot where I was going with that. Oh yeah, one of the comments we got was like version-specific documentation for when there are changes. Because if you get too current, like there's people who are still on 2.4 or 2.5, and if the documentation, like if all it documents is 2.6, there might be too much stuff there or inaccurate stuff there. I don't know if that will be possible with new documentation system, but yeah, like you said, if version control would be solid. Yeah.
Is it something with the new documentation system where you can just archive the old documentation and they could refer to that every time there's a version change?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So then you end up with a version specific.
Yeah.
What Kevin brought up about YouTube videos, in general, is there an interest in alternate formats for documentation or alternate formats for learning how to do things or point people that work with you toward doing things?
When we started to implement, we found the videos much more helpful than the written documentation in terms of how-tos. But again, there was a lot of version issuing with some of that stuff.
Yeah. One of the projects Jessica is directing this year is updating the broad training videos in the member area that sort of give the overviews of how to do big parts of the application. But yeah, we're going to do them on the current version, not on, we will archive the old videos, but it's hard to do a totally new set of videos for every version. Are there any other formats of documentation or instruction that people have found helpful with people they work with, or find that are really helpful for them learning something? Yeah.
So one thing, we just implemented the Harvard Excel plugin, and in our template is actually filled out with sample data.
Really?
So people can see where this note goes, how the hierarchical levels relate. Because we have documentation, we have blank templates, but I think for some folks, they see that giant Excel spreadsheet and they don't know, like, where should this thing go? Where do I put my title?
Mm-hmm.
And to see the actual sample data filled out has been very useful.
Mm-hmm.
The trick is to delete it so that you're not importing that sample data.
Same record 100 times.
Sorry, what was that you just said?
So that was, so we're using the Harvard Excel plugin, which allows you to put stuff in, and we just have a filled out template that it provides examples for all the different fields.
Where are you?
At Columbia. And that is actually on our GitHub repository, which is RBML. It's like if you Google GitHub Columbia RBML, it will show up.
Yeah, we do that too. We have one tab that's the example,
Mm-hmm.
and then once they fill it out, they can, because they're just importing that one tab.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's very helpful.
We're also using the Excel, and I think it's really from Harvard. I think we may have made some changes to it. But we have a document that someone internal made that we call the Hide Guide, which is just a guide to how it's like a Word document, shows how every field is used, and it also says hide these fields because you're never going to use them. So I found that very helpful. I just finished like 500 linear foot finding aid using only Excel and then importing it into ArchivesSpace. So the Hide Guide was really essential in helping with that. So that kind of, I don't know, if we could share that kind of documentation across repositories and see how they compares, that would be great. And ours is available publicly on our book guide for ArchivesSpace at Yale.
There is a great resource that a working group of the Technical Advisory Council put together, that Anne Marie worked on, the Awesome List, that pulls together all kinds of like links to different resources. So people don't have to actually put it in that thing, they only have to put the link to that thing. So it sounds like things like this could be really great additions to the Awesome List.
I don't know if there would be any interest in having a repository in the Sandbox that's full of sample data. Obviously, that's what the Sandbox is there for, but if you've literally never used it before, you don't even know how to import your own sample. So it could just be a repo that's always there.
That came up this morning in the session I had, and that was also something we thought would be very useful.
It would also give, for the API side, it's the first time you get to issue a GET, and you could use it in the screencasts, so that people could literally use the same.
So like our Sandbox gets rebuilt once a week. It gets flushed out, it's blank every week. But if instead of it being blank, there was like a certain set of data in there that went in every time that it never got flushed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything else got flushed, but
Or if it got flushed, it just rebuilt. Like
Yeah.
that, you know.
yeah.
And with real finding, I guess real finding is like, even maybe some warts and all, like have some trailing commas.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left, and this is the question of what would make it easier? Would you be interested in improving the ArchivesSpace documentation? There's definitely lots of great suggestions here, so these give us lots of ways to improve it. Would people be specifically interested in helping with this? And if you were, what would make it easier to do that?
Supervisor buy-in.
If in the new user manual, if there were a way to comment on it or submit, the technical documentation already has a way to submit a pull request with the change that you think should happen. It is through GitHub, so I know that can be intimidating for some people. But if you were able to, when you came across a piece of documentation that you saw was inaccurate or was confusing, if you could leave a comment, would you do that, do you think? Okay. Kevin, do you have other questions or ideas that have come now from this wonderful discussion?
Yeah, no, I think that for us moving forward with new documentation system, there's a lot to think about and a lot of things that some I know we can do because I know what the new documentation system is, or I think I do. But yeah, no, there's definitely some ideas we can run with for this that are really helpful. So this has been good for our team, I think.